Welcome everyone to our seminar series, Working Tools, Community-Facing Data Management Platforms for Indigenous University Partnerships. My name is Andrew Martindale, and I'm here on behalf of the organizing team of Eric Simons and Allison Wiley. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you're doing okay in these difficult times. Many of us reside and work on unceded Indigenous territory in settler colonial spaces. And at UBC, it's customary to recognize the institution's place in this history through a land acknowledgement, which I would like to think extends into virtual space. I'm going to read it right now. UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The land it is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. I'd also like to mention that this issue remains unresolved, and I'm going to point you to a 2019 article by Michelle Daigle on her recent experience as an Indigenous scholar at UBC. Her title gives you a sense of her analysis. It's called The Spectacle of Reconciliation, on the unsettling responsibilities to Indigenous peoples in the academy. And I've put the link to this important work in the chat so you can check it out yourself. A few technical notes as we get started. Please keep your microphones and video feeds turned off. If you have a question or comment, you can add it to the chat or send it directly to Eric Simons. We'll be compiling these for discussion later after the presentation. You can ask your questions directly if you wish, or you can send them to Eric, who will forward them for you to Elroy. This seminar series had a convoluted path. It was conceived of as a SSHRC-funded workshop component of last year's Green College Interdisciplinary Speaker Series, Indigenous Science Partnerships Exploring Histories and Environments, that was organized by Allison Wiley and Eric Simons. This initial effort was canceled by a January snowstorm and then later by the pandemic. But I'm actually grateful that our reconstituted form is in a digital seminar, because it allows us to broaden our discussion beyond our original vision of a small group of primarily archaeological efforts. We're grateful to UBC's Green College for their ongoing support and patience, and to Aviva Rathbone and Musqueam for leading the way with their summer archaeological seminar series in Zoom, which was a proof of concept that we have been following. Our goal was to bring together university-based scholars and their partners in Indigenous communities who had collaboratively constructed shared platforms for knowledge dissemination and co-production, to present their projects and then reflect on what worked and what was not achieved. Access to and sovereignty over data produced by such efforts is a core principle of ethics, one enshrined in the Tri-Council's mandate of knowledge mobilization, and in UBC's Indigenous Strategic Plan, especially Goal 3, Action 13, on the ethical management of data. These are essential responsibilities for any university, but difficult to fully achieve. As Michelle Daigle argues, echoing scholars like Glenn Coulthard, a lot of aspirations of non-Indigenous scholars working with Indigenous partners are performative and even self-serving. Our hope was that the lessons of this group might guide us in practical terms towards a goal of tools that work. And I hope you're looking forward to these presentations as much as I am. It's a great honor to introduce our first speaker in this series. Tatsu Yamajalis is an archaeologist with considerable experience on these issues. Also known as Elroy White, Tatsu did his graduate work at SFU and is the owner and operator of Central Coast Archaeology, a consulting firm that works primarily with his own Heiltsuk community. He's a potlatch historian, a speaker, a dancer, and a singer, whose archaeology is grounded in the scholarship of his community. His work Ask people to turn their microphones off if you wouldn't mind. Put them on mute if that would be okay. Elroy's work echoes that of Richard Atleo in defending the science within Heiltsuk understanding, and that of Charles Menzies in appropriating archaeology in ways that confront and confound traditional disciplinary assumptions. Tatsu plays a liminal role in translating between the colonial and Indigenous worlds and in forging a kind of scholarship that lights the way for many of us. So we're delighted that he's going to be launching this seminar series. His is at times a lonely road, and he mentioned to me recently that he attended a meeting in Victoria in which the Indigenous archaeologists had outnumbered the non-Indigenous archaeologists, and he had noted wryly that this may have been a historical first. In his role as a rediscoverer, a recorder, and a steward of the heritage landscape of the Heiltsuk community, he has encountered a lot of barriers, several of which he will outline in his presentation today. Tatsu Yamajalis' talk is entitled, "You Cannot Manage What You Do Not Know, Heiltsuk Traditional Site Use and Mapping, It is an analysis of the challenges of managing heritage for an Indigenous community when the data systems are controlled by outsiders. Please join me in welcoming him as our first presenter in our Working Tools seminar series. Elroy?
Great, thank you, Andrew. How's this?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Andrew. I had to put my headphones on because it's raining, beat the band up here, and it's kind of a distraction. So, but again, thank you for the invitation to present. It's such an honor to open up the seminars, and considering that when this first started, I was literally on the outside of this. I was a collaborator on the Hoyt project, and now you and I had talked during that time as that I told you about this project, and it fit exactly with what this whole tool series is about. And in that way, because of the COVID, I've been able just to finish off the project and then refine the proposal or the PowerPoint. So even though it's called You Can't Manage What You Don't Know, it really, and it fits with the seminar topic. This is really an internal presentation of how us as Heltzig, or Heichchuk as we say, because we use Heichchuk now, and is how we manage and collect data. Data, collect it and manage it for our own office. And we have had a number of outside archaeologists and academics come through ever since Hakai started up on Calvert Island. And that was overwhelming. You know, a few times when I was on Calvert Island, after dinners, I was approached by students asking for some input, direction, and because I'm not a direct employee of HERMD, I always had to, even myself, I had to step back and wait for HERMD's approval. And they always did that later on. And so once they did the blanket approval, the students who approached me, I was able to be an advisor to them. So this project, I was approached by the director of the HERMD, Kelly Brown, and asked me if I could lead this one on behalf of the nation. And so he had directed me to the First Peoples Culture Council, and so that we could apply for a grant so that we can get together the departments of HERMD so that we can present this, conduct this research on the HERMD behalf. So there was sort of the grant called Sense of Place, reconnecting to the land through Indigenous culture heritage. And HERMD provided administrative support, office support. They're involved, their crews. Some of them you can see in the PowerPoint here. And the Health Integrated Resource Management Department is also known as HERMD, and it's a stewardship arm of the Healthig Nation. So it's a standalone entity. And it's a very important one as it manages culture and natural resources. And they've asked, I was directed to ask the staff members of the GIS department, aquatics, or also known as coastal guardians, the culture and heritage manager, Jennifer Carpenter of Culture Education Center, and my crew, Central Coast Archaeology. And I became that link to the HERMD office. And this is our collaborative project. HERMD is responsible for these topics that are listed in the PowerPoint: land, water, and culture. They're technical advisors to the council, and they're also technical advisors and support to the HEATMAS, our chiefs. And they're the ones who hold the power and authority of our territory. So the responsibilities are many, and there's only a few here listed: land and marine, land and fisheries, forestry. And in fact, when I first started archaeology here, I was basically living in the forest, doing archaeology work with a local crew mostly. And then HERMD continued with reconciliation protocol agreements, and then the protection of culture and heritage. And often they fought battles with the Archer ants and others about how to do that, especially from the Celtic perspective. And this started 10 years ago, 2010. So their chiefs, as I mentioned, are the ones who hold the power and authority of our territory. And they do it through their new yams, their stories, and it gives them the right to their land. Their bloodlines are in these new yams or stories. They're ancient, some are new. Regardless, they're still a pathway from their ancestry, their hierarchy, down to their family units and their interrelated family units across BC. For those who don't know where Celtic is, it's on the central coast, 400 kilometers north of the mainland, and it's on an isolated island called Campbell Island, as you can see in the red. And they occupy the inlets, the deep inlets, but not the whole, everything on this map is Celtic. And then they also include the inner waterways and the outer islands, and that includes part of Calvert. And we're the dominant population, the modern population right now. And from that, our people have occupied these physiographic zones I just mentioned to you. And the Celtic are part of 5 tribes that are remembered. There are many others who died out possibly from smallpox and other diseases. We speak a language called Heiltjachola to speak Celtic, or Heiltjach. And it forms a real complex culture that's connected from today to the past. And so the Heiltjach are firm believers, of course, that their ancestry began since time immemorial. So this, for the project, it was my job with my assistant, Charles Brown, Charlie, and he's learned on the job as an archaeology field assistant over the last 3 to 5 years. And he started off working with me in the woods, in the forestry. He was an engineer at one time, an assistant engineer. And in between projects, Charlie would join me when I needed a field crew. So instead of calling out to any of my colleagues, my art colleagues, I supported locally, and many of them came through this office to support our archaeology surveys. So in the HERMD office, we have the GIS office, and that's probably one of the most important offices in our department. It's we currently have 2 trained GIS technicians, and they work on everything on culture and natural resources. So they have a huge umbrella. Archaeology is only a small part, but it's integral to many of anything under that umbrella. So the staff that work out of there are archaeologists such as myself, guardian, watchman, and we had high school students who job shadowed with HERM staff and the guardians on the water. And our first intent was to focus on GIS mapping of burials. And it's been reported to our office that a few burials had been found by the guardians. And because they use a different recording device than what I use, my crew uses, it led to some miscommunication and incompatible data that was shared amongst us. And because of that, sometimes projects just stalled, didn't prompt us to create a survey. And within this department, we have Jennifer Carpenter, who's manager of the culture and heritage for the last 20, 30 years. And she provided the history and a time frame of when GIS started, and also her other huge responsibilities of TOS, Traditional Use Study, Culture and Heritage Management, language, and supporting all the entities within our nation. So during the workshop, we hosted a workshop for 5 days and was based out of the HERMD office. And the 5 crew members from the Guardians and GIS Culture Center, the school and the SEAS program joined us. And 2 of the students job shadowed, and so they learned how each department gathered data. And they learned of the problems that we have that's associated with each data collection technique. And prior to this, I'd been busy with the SEAS program. They're in Bella Bella, Clem 2, and Bella Coola, and they provide the opportunities for the youth to connect to their territories and their family tribal areas, and harvesting and learning how to document places, especially through the language that is so integral to our nation. And here, in the slide here, you can see top left is us with the group meeting. And then on the bottom left is Astrid, Sandy, who's just recently graduated, and she's an SFU student right now, criminology, I believe. And to the right is my grandson, Keegan. So Keegan was just a baby when I finished my MA, and I became a grandfather. It's kind of funny. I remember Al McMillan always teasing me that I beat him. But here's Keegan now, 15 years later, and he's putting auger through one of our reserve sites. And he's vowed to take over CCA, Central Coast Archaeology. And there's Astrid on the bottom taking pictures of rock art. So both the Guardians and Central Coast Archaeology took turns mentoring these students about how to record sites. And we found during those field visits that we weren't on the right page. We didn't use the same terminology. Archaeology is so specific to the Guardians who are trained in archaeology by somewhat from outsiders in Prince Rupert. They often came back with different terms that I didn't understand. And it probably meant that I was just out of the loop for so long. But this is how we in Health territory understand them. So it was important for us to get on the same page. Each office presented their roles in acquisition and management of this archaeological data. And here we have Charlie presenting to the chiefs. And these are the people I mentioned who have power and authority over a territory. And they're all advisors to the Health Tribal Council as well. So Charlie is here presenting on the results of one of our projects, burial projects. So archaeology, for those who are not familiar, is a science, but also incorporates oral history. And it's something that I knew that I'd have to get into myself, not being a scientist. And I also didn't want to be too focused on oral history, because sometimes in these stories in the oral history, it lacked scientific data. So I felt that it was important to bridge the two together. The archaeology to our nation that we're Haistchuk, so it represents the Haistchuk past. And they consist of material cultural things. And here's a list of 7 types that are known here. And they may vary up and down the coast. And during this presentation, I basically focused on number 2, the burials, and number 3, the rock art. Top left there is Charlie recording with a phone device. iPhones today have high definition that they capture images very clearly. They're perfect for reports and presentations. And that's me in the middle on a glabbeat, or glabbeat as we call them, whether or not they have a rock wall. This is called a Clam Garden. And it's one that I recorded during my thesis. It was the first one I had ever seen in our territory as an academic. But I do recall seeing them when I was when I used to do a clam digging with my dad and his brother. And I didn't think anything of them at the time. And then there's my grandson again. So to the haystack, what does archaeology mean? Well, it means two things. That it's an academic profession, and it's based out of universities, and professors and grad students attempt to answer specific questions for their PhD and their MAs. And it could be either excavation or site-specific. Some could be even just oral history or desktop. For me, I selected Celtic stone fish traps, products of my ancestors' labor. Originally, I had selected expression of my ancestral knowledge. Either way, it made sense. And the academics, of course, apply for their own funds and they to answer their own questions, and they publish in journal articles or books. Lately, websites. It's also CRM, Cultural Resource Management. And that's the one that was primarily it was the focus here in forestry. And the companies would come up here, or individuals own their own companies, and they just put dots on their map, site inventory and documentation. And then the idea was to either protect the site or that it recommended be altered. As I mentioned earlier, when I spent most of my time in the forest, I took over CRM of the companies that were here. And it was really sometimes quite awkward. I was telling Andrew this, that when these companies were holding permits, which allow really detailed reporting, strict guidelines. It also allowed for the option for alteration. We went into ecosystem-based management 2005, and that changed how the province and the Celtic, the Haitchuk, would co-manage, or work together to manage cultural resources. No longer, the permit was no longer an option. And then I ended up inheriting most of the contracts up here. And at that time, EBM took over. And there was a lot, and Hearn became quite the powerful authority over the forest. And they were always in communication with the forest companies. And I was that bridge between them and the forest companies. All sites were all protected with or without a permit. It didn't matter at this point. What mattered was what the Haitchuk thought, and us and the elders. So no sites would be altered. So this leads me to the part of the presentation that was really important to the Sense of Grant project. And as you can see on this PowerPoint, drop boxes with labels, different colored pins, squiggly lines, different colors. And this is a tool of Central Coast Archaeology, and it was something that started a number of years ago. And for us, this is how we saw it from the office at the end of this project. GIS office is the most important because all the data eventually goes to the GIS staff. They send it out to review to Guardians, myself, and the Culture Center and other integrated departments. It leads to a prompt for one of us or for collaboration to actually go see, or to either site survey or go just monitor a site. Unfortunately, at the time, or still is happening, the Guardians use an Android, and it has a map of all the BC, interior included. And it's just like your Google map on your vehicle. The blue dot on the map shows you where you're going. So it's good for navigation. And it has a lot of drop boxes on there, and they're already filled out, and then you just write some details in it, or you just click a few boxes and take some photos. Well, we didn't have that access to that info. That's part of the Coastal Guardian network. So we use the Avenza program, which I'll get into, and it turns out both are incompatible to each other. So we have two different crews using different devices. So this led to miscommunication or no communication. So if a site was found, like a burial, or just say there was a boat up against a stonefish trap, and then this information was conveyed to GIS, to the HERM, then it ended at GIS where the spot is. Sometimes it didn't lead to anything until months or years later. And that, it resulted in no prompts. That's what we're calling these prompts. So no action. So this picture was taken by my nephew. So my Central Coast Archaeology is basically myself and local field assistants who've been working with me over the years. And in this case, most of the people who've worked with me have been my nephews. And it wasn't my design, it just so happened to be that way. In this case, my nephew Max Johnson Jr. took the picture, and it has an engineer holding an iPad, and there's me with my book. And we had incompatible devices or data collection. So that led me to go pursue the purchase of an Avenza mapping program for my iPad. And it's an app on the iPad that you can download, and there's different options, and I think the price goes about $160 for a year, or you can get one that's longer term. And they're geo-referenced PDF maps that you create on your GIS technician, or you do it yourself on QGIS like myself. And then you can email it to your iPad, and then you download it onto your iPad into the Avenza program. And then it's site specific, so that means you have to be in the site area for the blue dot to appear. This is where it differs from the Androids that the Coastal Guardians use. So the blue dot aids you in seeing where you're traversing, so it's great for navigation. It saves your tracks, but you have to fill out the command, press a few buttons, and then you can measure after a while how far you've gone or how far you have to go, or how long the site is too. And then you can save specific areas with a waypoint, but they call them place marks on Avenza. Place mark 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you have the option to change the label. And then it also takes photographs, and it has an option for descriptions as well. So it's a very specific type of a recording device that has drop boxes similar to the Androids, but I find it a bit more user-friendly. So this is what it looks like, and I hope you all can see it. On the left is the maps. Hello? Hello? We good to go?
Good to go, Elroy. I think somebody's mic just turned on.
Okay, good. If you can look, when you look on your left, is when you open up the Avenza, it has these options: My Maps, Layers, Store, and Settings. I only use the 3. And so the My Maps is where you download all your maps. And if you don't geo-reference it and you upload it into your Avenza, it'll tell you not reference. So it literally becomes useless to your program and to your objective. And in the middle is the map, and it has a lot of features on there already that I just wanted to show you. And this is what we used in one of our last projects. To the left is when you open it up, you can, I mentioned you can record your tracks, so your traverses, and it gives you the options, location tracking and navigation, and even as a compass, how far you've gone, measures quite a few important data collection topics. How long you've been walking. Just press that green button and you're off to go. The only problem with this is that sometimes when it's raining hard, the iPad opens, the rain will press stop, and it won't, and then you stop recording your track. So you always have to check your iPad. And to the right is other options, and if you click down to the, or you look in the bottom where my arrow is, these 3 dots, it opens up this drop box, and it gives you these options. You can georeference maps, and that way, that's very valuable. Navigate to your next destination. You can draw and measure and record GPS tracks. And when you want to export and you want to share your data, you have a few options as well. One of them, on the right-hand side, you can airdrop, but only if you have a compatible device. So you have to have another iPad or an iPhone. And it doesn't use up any data. And you can drop everything. And I'll explain that in a bit. Or you can just export to others and it'll go to your email. And the buttons are on the bottom. And then you get the export settings. This is the 4 options of how you could send your data. KML, CSV, or table, GPX, or shapefile. And this last one's really important because it sends your photos as well. Before it didn't, so they upgraded Avenza. But when you do send it, if you don't send it through AirDrop, it uses up a lot of data. So in this slide here, photographs and description, it shows these drop boxes that I clicked on. Shovel test 22, shovel test 23, and so on. And you can see the number of pictures that are saved in that one point. Here's a place mark that I labeled as a waypoint, and I relabel it as shovel test 22. And this happens to be a glad beach, a clam beach with a rock wall. There happens to be 2 in this one spot, and they were built around this tombolo. And to the top left is an ARC site, FBTA 25. It was recorded in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And so one of the objectives of our project, our prompt, was first go see if this was recorded and plotted in the right location. So this is us checking out the site. And if you look top left, I recorded GPS tracks. I recorded 3 of them. And this one here, there's canoe runs of row of rocks parallel to each other that bisect the beach to the shoreline. And this is like a parking space for canoes, where canoes would be pulled up. And this slide, this part, is us walking what we consider to be FBTA 25. And then we took a test and we put a pin down, took some photos. And then what we realized too is that there was a creek coming down and it wasn't on the map. So we walked it so that we could have this for reference. And then to the right, I measured the distance of the village site, that FBTA 25, and it turns out it was 50 meters long. And then on the bottom, I opened everything up, all the drop boxes, and it gives you an idea of all this. And this you could share with your crew while you're in the woods or in the beach or whatever you're doing. And the important thing is don't ever lose your iPad. That's it for you if you do. And because it doesn't back up to anything while you're out in the out in a survey or some project. And see, these are the pictures of FBTA 25. So on the left is a terrace with regen hemlock trees and then spruce trees on the bottom, and a sloped surface, about 30–40%, with lily of the valley growing on it. And it's like a park literally inside this village. And being 50 meters long, probably, if 10 meters wide is the width of a big house, as we call them here. 5 houses stood at this place. And here's I don't want to call it the parking space, but this is where the canoe runs are. And there's firecrack rock everywhere on this beach. And this is where FBTA 2025 was plotted. And then this is FBTA 25. And usually village sites have these tall, dark green spruce trees, and they grow on old cedar nurse logs, and they form literally a rectangle around the site. And as if you take a look where it was plotted, those are absent. But what I found here, though, excellent berry picking spot, huckleberries and blueberries. So I'm getting near the end of the presentation, believe it or not. And I was talking to Andrew about this for our data management. And this is something our crew end up looking for. And the guardians are out in the territory more than my crew. And they're doing crab surveys, stream walks, they're monitoring boat activities and so on. They're collecting their own data. And in this case, on the top, it says Gayachti Reserve. It's a federal reserve. And we have over 20 in our territory. According to the map, Gayachti is right here, where the drop box is open. I have a question mark beside it and a pin. And right away, the Guardians knew that there wasn't anything there. And so we set off to test this. This was our prompt. So we worked together. And sure enough, when we got here, there was no reserve. And the black circle there, or oval, is our track, the boat making a track where we thought it was. And then I pinned it. Well, it turns out Gayachti was a recorded ARC site, FBTB21, and it's an island in front of Yo Cove. And it's a very significant spot in our history. And this is Gayachti right here. And it's a fortress type of island. And the whole island, as you can see spruce trees on top of it, growing out of it. The significance of that, there's shell midden. And we ended up testing this through an auger down a few times on the reserve. We don't need an ARC permit for that. So we kept the data, of course, and it's in our GIS office. And this is my grandson as we found this spot and we plotted the point. So we went back to where it was plotted on the map and took a picture. So that's the picture. Sorry for going back, right here. This pin is this picture where the reserve plotted. So we'll submit this data to the powers to be to plot the reserve in the right location. As I mentioned, as a part of the Sense of Place grant, we focused on burials because they're the most sacred of one of the most sacred of our site types. And so we did some background research of where we could find these burials in our territory, either in caves or boulder outcrops, sometimes in stumps of trees or burnt out trees. And they're also modern. and grave houses or some kind of log cabin style cribbing. And according to research done in '97 by Millennia Action Group, Jennifer Carpenter Culture Center, the local field workers, generally in Celtic territory, this is where we find burials. And this was our prompt. I guess others would call it predictive modeling. And I often get confused with that, so I prefer prompt. I understand it better. And it's something that our crew uses as well. Because predictive modeling is so academic. There's so many things that you can factor into it. And it can be found in association with pictographs of rock paintings. And then under dry rock overhangs and so on. So we tested this. It was our prompt to go away. Before we could even make a site visit, we had to ask permission from the Hermed Office and get support from the Aquatics, Culture and Heritage Management, and later on the chiefs and elders. And here's Charlie sharing this data at the Hermed Office with the Heatmas, our chiefs. And we also have Jennifer, who's our Culture Center Director, Mike Reed, Aquatics Director, Fran Brown, who is a language, has an ongoing language program, Kelly, who is our ED, our Executive Director of the Hermed Office. And then we have the chiefs, late Mark White, who used to just Joanne Green, Kayet, Arnold Humchik. These three chiefs have their own territory within the Celtic Nation. And because as you heard Andrew say, I'm grounded in my potlatch protocols, potlatch system. Before, when I graduated, I was referencing internalist archaeology, and I knew that I used that in my thesis. And if you've read my thesis, you will know that my name is Chatnius, which is a name I got passed down to me in the 80s from on the White family side. It's from Rivers Inlet. Later on, I co-authored papers with Duncan McLaren and a few others, and I decided to use my childhood name, Gikla. Gikla means dear one. And then last year I received another name, Tatsu, and I share Yamajalis with my father. And I'm not testing you on this, but my grandson is now Gikla. I passed it down to him. So I remember someone asking me one time, they're not going to be able to find you if you use Chatnius. I said, it doesn't matter. They'll find me by the title, Celtic Stonefish Traps or something. And if they see my name is Gikla and they scratch their heads, well, they have to understand our potlatch protocol. It's not foreign to us, but it's foreign to them. And it's something they need to learn. We had to learn yours and so on. So that's our perspective. And the Hermed Office provides that opportunity where we can collaborate and be respectful of each other's perspectives. So with that in mind, when we go visit our sacred burial sites, we're not to be afraid of them because these people are our ancestors and we treat them just like our modern relatives who have passed on. We weren't afraid of them then while they're living. We're not afraid of them now as they're in the spiritual world. And I know this is not science, but this is a respectful protocol that belongs to these chiefs. They're the authority, and they ensure that these burials are treated respectfully, because before they were looted by hand loggers and skulls were removed in some places from archaeologists in the past and other great good for taking. And then other people as well. So what does that mean when we go visit a site? Well, based on our potlatch protocol and our understanding of our mortuary customs, we follow the protocols that we have learned over time. We identify ourselves. We do it by our ancestral names or Indian names. And we identify who our family is. So it's not just John Smith. If it's Tatsu is connected up to one family and then connected elsewhere. Has a complex interaction and interrelationship with other people up and down the coast. And then our roles as archaeology crew. And that part is probably the most important because of what I just told you. How graves were looted by others. These spirits are still there and they harbor their feelings. And it's also for our own mindset. We're not practicing what others have done. And we're mentors of the next generation. Even though I'm older than Charlie, he's my nephew, so we're multi-generational. And when he learns it, he passes it on. So it doesn't stop with him. He continues on this process. This is what we do in Potlatchy. We ask permission. And rarely have we heard an answer. So that's the good thing. We know we're doing something right. And by doing that, it gives us a sense of relief and sense of accomplishment. That what we're going to do is important to the Haitian Nation and to the ancestors. And all the time we talk to them, even if we don't see them. And a lot of us do this when you go to your own modern cemeteries and you talk to your loved one, you do the same thing. And because it's our responsibility to visit these sites on behalf of the Hermit Office and the HIMAS, we must be respectful. We tell the ancestors we're there for data management, data collection. And we're going to tell them we're going to be measuring, taking photographs, and taking descriptions. And there's a few of us who will be wandering around doing specific tasks. We gather the GPS data on the Avenza iPad, create waypoints and tracks, and we label everything. And then we leave everything as is. We do not move anything. We don't remove. And if we have to lift something up, we'll tell the ancestors, we're going to lift this board up. We want to see what's underneath. We can't manage what we don't know. And if that board happens to have a design on it, that's even better. That design hasn't seen daylight 100 to 400 years, maybe longer. And it could be other important data there, important pieces to that. And it helps us understand and learn and understand the ancient burial practice of our people, so that when we visit more and more over time, we're not going to be surprised. So we're always open to finding something new. And if we do move something accidentally, we always apologize. So we're real Canadian. So we follow the Canadian, we always apologize. But we do that here in the Haitian people too. And it's very important because that piece had been sitting there a long time and the ancestors remember. Before we leave, we thank the spirits. We'll either do a blessing or a celebration song. And this is basically to honor them for giving us permission to do our work. We can't sing a morning song because they've already been taken care of by their relatives of the day. You only sing the morning song at one time. And you have to sing the right song. And if you don't know the right song, then you explain what you know and then share it. Everything is confidential, and that's the reason why I couldn't share specifics of what we found. And I was telling Andrew that there's 14,000-year-old trinket and there's 13,000-year-old footsteps. But some of these burials that we found, that's my old 14,000 and my footsteps. these, and this, because these people were our direct ancestors. And what we're doing is so sacred, we don't want to upset anything. And all the data is submitted to the Hermed Office to the GIS. It's reviewed by Culture Center, it's reviewed by Aquatics, Guardians, and we present it to the chiefs. And if it is to be shared, Herm has to approve first. And then, of course, they would advise council and they would advise the chiefs. Very strict. And most times, this data is not shared with the province. Who's better to manage these sites than the Hermed Office? And that's why it's so important for my crew to follow these protocols, the burial recording methods, and for our office to have a shared type of data capture. This is way bigger than for the province. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but this is just the feeling that I've learned that comes from our chiefs and elders and our advisors. A few pictures that I can share. Burials are found near rock shelters. And the crew taking a break after we found one spot. And the Guardians happened to have one of their trainers with them, and she came out with us. And this is basically what we found. This place was looted, and it had a carved box, an old carved image on it. And it was so important that that box was collected and it was stored over the winter. The art team that returned, when they returned, it was gone. I don't know how it ended up in the Royal BC Museum, but that's where it is right now, waiting to be repatriated. So the archaeology crew who found it in the 60s, this is what they found. The outer CMT planks, the outer box as we call it, a lid, and the inner box is gone, including that carved panel. And this is what we found. So it's almost in the same location. Everything's in the same location. So it hasn't really been disturbed since then. If it has, it's been by natural predators. And it's like a victory to us when we do find a burial. We know how sensitive it is to be doing this kind of work, because some archaeologists would prefer not to. I'm not sure if it's because it's so sacred or it's because the art branch has their own strict guidelines. And it's something that we, who are descendant of those chiefs, and we make up the modern population of and descended from those ancestors, we feel we have the right to record. And we don't share the same feelings as others who would rather not record these in detail. And that's why it was important for this project that we create this data management tool for our Hermed Office. And it's still ongoing. Even though the project's over, we're still refining it. That's just like with the... So once we're done, our job is to make sure everything's labeled correctly, and then we'll go to the GIS office. So I create a table with my Avenza label on the left. For some reason, the table, something happened to the line here, but this is where I labeled it while I was in the field. And then I put it into my QGIS and I relabeled them, some of them, and I set to send to the GIS office. Like I said, these guys, they work on so many other projects. This is so specific, they have to relearn it every time because we don't do it all the time. So by the time it goes from boulder box panel to C1 with red triangle, by the time it gets to the GIS office, I put it a temporary board number, the date it was recorded, who recorded it, and a temporary number. And then that is then stored in the GIS department. And just say something happened, someone said there was a burial disturbed in this one area. The GIS man, technician would then go into his files and he'll be able to find it. He'll know by the board and grid number, not just by the tribe territory. And this will lead a prompt to the guardians who will check it. And then this, unfortunately for this doesn't go onto their Androids. So if they have an iPad or an iPhone with a Venza on it, then he can create a point for them. But if it comes to us, then we will get the specific data and it'll prompt us to go take a look. And with all the details in our descriptions, our photographs, measurements, and so on, we'd be able to determine if it had been impacted at all. So this is the crew. Wally, one of the guardians. Charlie, my nephew. My grandson, Keegan, who's now taller than me, by the way. My relative, Josh Vickers, and myself. And we are all related to each other somehow, indirectly in most cases. So Charlie would be more related to Wally than I am. And I'm related to Josh more than Charlie, and so on. We're a multi-generational crew, mostly adults here. I'm the only older fella. And then there's the young fella, my grandson. Learning the techniques from both the Guardians and the CCA crew, and understanding the process, like Astrid, who was in the earlier pictures, that these are steps that we have to follow, and that we must not harbor or hoard the data. We must be able to share it within the department so that we can work as a team. The integration that mentioned, that's what HealthSec Integrated Resource Management Department. And the significance of this photo, this is where that reserve was plotted. So we thought we'd get a group photo. And that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elroy. That was a wonderful and powerful way to start our seminar series. I'm sure there's lots of questions. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you're welcome to turn your microphone on and video feed and ask a question directly. While you're thinking of what your question might be for Elroy, I've got a question for you, Elroy, if I can. You pointed out that the reserve boundary was out in the middle of the ocean rather than where it was supposed to be on land. And it looked like in that example you showed where the archaeological site polygon was also quite offset. How common is that the provincial and federal data systems that house knowledge about your territory are in error?
For the reserves, there's 20, so it is quite common. And almost all the reserves, the boundaries are not lined up with the shoreline. And so that affects us, or any archaeologist or any data collector, that, well, HealthSec know where the boundary is. But if you're science-based, and to say I'm really science-based, I can't do any work in an area that's not on reserve. And so that's our conflict that we have. And so for the reserve, it is quite common. And then for the provincial sites, the board-in numbers, it is quite common too, because back in the 60s and the 70s, they didn't have the right maps. And a lot of times their surveys were really quite sketchy, cursory, really quick, going from like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all down the road. And then sometimes they didn't do the data entry right away, and then they guessed. And so for one of our burials, it was off by 400. So it's common for most of our burials to be plotted incorrectly. And so that's our prompt to go. So that's why it's different. While we use prompt, it's different from predictive modeling, because we're no longer predicting that it's there or it's wrong. We just know it's wrong. So it's our prompt, it's our signal to go.